We want to dig deeper into the current situation between Russia and Ukraine, which is changing rapidly, and the part the United States plays in it. My guests tonight are Thomas Graham, a distinguished fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and Kristine Berzina is a senior fellow from the Alliance for Securing Democracy. Thank you both for joining us. Thomas, I want to begin with you. Americans have seen a lot about Ukraine and Russia in the news lately, and really on and off for years. For the average American, what's at stake here, and why does it matter?
Well, it matters because what is at stake from the American standpoint are the norms and rules of European security. The rules that say that a country is sovereign, it has territorial integrity, it has the right to determine its own foreign policy, its own domestic policy. And those are the things that Russia is putting at threat at this moment.
Kristine, we looked at the map earlier, and it's obvious why Russia cares so much about Ukraine, but this isn't just about geography, right? You say it's a matter of pride and credibility for Russia. What exactly do you mean by that?
Absolutely. So Ukraine, of course, it is a gigantic country by European standards between Russia and the Black Sea, strategically of interest. But we're not really talking about why it matters today in 2022. We're not talking about why it has mattered to Russia historically. Losing Ukraine is a wound in President Putin's perception of what Russia should be. There are really deep historical reasons for that. The dates we looked at just now at the beginning of the segment go back to the 90s, but where we could start looking at is the 9th century and the first Russian state, or the ancient Rus, which was founded in Kiev. Because of this and that ancient history, the President Putin talks about the Ukrainians and the Russians as one people. And the notion of Kiev lying outside of what is modern Russia is uncomfortable. So you have the literally ancient history, and you then have a second piece, which is, the woundedness that Russia felt in the 1990s when it felt like it had to make significant concessions beyond what it, as a, until that point, superpower, should have been forced to make. Having Ukraine back, having a larger sphere of influence and larger territory is really important. And the absence of that is a tragedy in President Putin's view. He called this the loss, the breakup of the Soviet Union, the loss of these territories, the greatest tragedy in the 20th century. And that, I think, tells you a lot about the emotional and psychological, historical reasons for Putin to be waging the campaign he is right now.
Is it realistic that another Soviet republic might be formed?
I don't think they'd call it a Soviet republic. There isn't. But is there a desire to have an imperial power, the kind of spheres of influence and mighty blocks we had in the 19th century? That's probably a more realistic desire. We've seen the Kremlin aggrandize the Tsarist era, the Romanov dynasty. There are deeper histories that they're trying to invoke, not just the Soviet. It's about what Russia is, right? And what this big country represents. That is really important. And that's why you have the invocation of such really old history and the imperial past before the Russian Revolution.
Thomas, you served as the senior director for Russian affairs to President George W. Bush. If you were in that role today, what would you advise President Biden to do now?
Well, American policy towards Russia has to have two components, deterrence and diplomacy. The administration has worked very hard on the deterrence part of this over the past several months, since the fall when it began to raise the alarms about the massing of Russian troops along Ukraine's borders. It has worked very hard with our allies in NATO. It's worked very hard with Ukraine itself to come up with a series of what it hopes are what the President Biden has called devastating sanctions that would be unleashed in the event of a Russian military incursion into Ukraine that would deter Russia from taking that action. The administration has worked with our NATO allies on ways we can augment our forces, NATO forces that is, in the eastern half of the continent, and those NATO countries that feel most vulnerable to menacing from Russia, Poland and the Baltic states, for example. And all of that is to provide a foundation for a diplomatic effort to see whether it's possible to negotiate with Russia a lessening of the tensions, a de-escalation of this crisis. And that diplomacy is just beginning. We saw the talks among our top officials in Geneva a couple of weeks ago, a conversation between Secretary of State Antony Blinken and his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov in Geneva last week. And there is a promise that there will be continued negotiations in the next couple of weeks at a minimum.
Well, the U.S. and NATO have threatened those devastating sanctions, as you just mentioned, but how much could those actually change the Kremlin's thinking?
Well, I don't think that they will have much of an impact on the Kremlin's thinking at this point for a number of reasons. One, as Kristine has already pointed out, Ukraine is of vital interest to Russia. They are prepared to sacrifice a great deal in order to attain their goals vis-a-vis Ukraine. The second is that Russia has lived with sanctions from the United States for many, many years. Those have accelerated since 2014 when Russia illegally annexed Crimea and fomented a separatist rebellion in the eastern part of Ukraine. So Russia over the past several years has become what they like to call sanctions-proof. They built up their foreign currency reserve, over $600 billion now, one of the largest pockets of cash in the world, to give them the ability to ride out any sanctions that the West may levy against them in the current scenario.
Kristine, last question to you here. Where do you think we go from here? Can relations between Ukraine and Russia stabilize, or is there too much history for the situation to settle anytime soon?
I'm fearful about good off-ramps from where we are today. President Putin has made a lot of demands of the United States, and of course, the U.S. would like to have other priorities focused on China. But the demands that Kremlin has made to essentially turn back time, create a sphere of influence, are so incompatible with what our Western institutions, with what they represent, their policies, and the values that we espouse, that there's no way for the United States or for NATO to accept them. So the question is, what kind of concessions can there be? And we're at loggerheads. President Putin has not asked for anything the West can provide and has a gigantic military position, over 100,000 troops on the border of Ukraine, to drive those threats home. Some kind of conflict, I think, is very likely to occur in this situation. And unfortunately, the question is more of scale. Should Russia come to the table with other demands that could feasibly be met in any way? Okay, then diplomacy could have a way out. But I really wish we could have a more substantive and productive conversation in the next weeks than we're capable of having right now.
Okay, Thomas Graham and Kristine Berzina, thank you so much for coming on.
You're welcome.
After